Most horror films leave a trail behind them. A director who talks about the shoot years later. Actors who move on to other roles. Studios that proudly or reluctantly claim ownership. But the films in this episode did something else. They entered the world normally. They were released. They were sold. They were watched. And then when people tried to look back, there was nothing solid to find. No reliable record of who directed them. No clear creative lineage. No careers that continued afterward. Sometimes not even agreement on which names belong in the credits. These movies weren't hidden. They weren't unfinished. They weren't bootlegs passed around in the shadows. They passed through official distribution channels as if everything was in order, and only later revealed how little was actually known about their creation. It's as if the films were allowed to exist, but the people behind them quietly stepped away from history. Tonight's story isn't about what happens on screen. It's about what's missing behind it. About horror films that feel disconnected from authorship itself. Released into circulation, then left suspended without anyone standing behind them to say this was ours. These are movies that don't belong to movement studios or filmmakers. They don't anchor themselves to careers. They simply remain unchanged, unclaimed, and unexplained. The unsettling part isn't that these films are hard to research. It's that they were never lost at all. They're still here, and no one seems willing or able to take responsibility for where they came from. Fact 1. The Dark Side of the Moon, 90. By the time The Dark Side of the Moon was released, the horror industry was becoming far more transparent. Studios kept records. Press materials were archived. Creative careers were easier to trace. This film quietly defies those expectations. It was released commercially, carried legitimate copyright information, and circulated through standard video distributors. Nothing about its release suggested secrecy or irregularity. Yet its creative origins remain surprisingly opaque. The director and writers are credited, but their involvement outside this project is limited and inconsistently documented. The production company associated with the film appears briefly in records, then disappears without leaving a discernible history. Details about development are scarce. There are no clear accounts of how the project was financed. No preserved behind-the-scenes material. No consistent narrative explaining how the film came together. Several cast members seem to vanish from filmography records soon after the release. There are no follow-up interviews and no later credits that clarify their professional paths. The Dark Side of the Moon feels like a late echo of the same phenomenon seen throughout this list. A fully released horror film that slipped through the cracks just as the industry was becoming harder to disappear from. It exists. It can still be watched, but its creation remains suspended in uncertainty. A reminder that even at the edge of the modern era, some films arrive without ever fully revealing who made them. Fact 2. The Majorettes, 1986. The Majorettes emerged during a period when low-budget horror films were being produced and released at a relentless pace. It had distribution advertising and a recognizable presence in the home video market. On paper, it should be easy to trace. In practice, it isn't. The director's name appears rarely outside this single title, with little documentation of a broader career. The credited writers and producers follow the same pattern, their names floating in databases without context or connection to other projects. Production details are inconsistent. Some sources contradict one another about filming locations and financing. Others offer no information at all, leaving major gaps in the film's backstory. The cast reflects the familiar disappearance seen throughout this episode. Several performers appear prominently, then leave no lasting trace in film or television. No interviews exist reflecting on the production. No retrospectives attempt to place the film within a creative lineage. There are no surviving production stills that clearly identify a working crew. No documented accounts explaining how the film moved from idea to release. The Majorettes survives as a finished product, but the people who made it seem to have stepped away from cinema entirely once it was complete. Fact 3. Don't Go to Sleep, 1982. Don't Go to Sleep was produced as a made-for-television horror film broadcast legally and repeatedly, complete with network approval and official credits. It was not obscure in its time. It was seen by wide audiences. Yet when its creative history is examined, the trail feels unusually thin. The director's career appears fragmented, with limited documentation beyond a small cluster of loosely connected projects. The writing credits are even harder to contextualize. Names appear, but without a clear creative background that explains how the story originated or who shaped it. What's most striking is how little material survives around the production itself. There are no detailed production records, no preserved interviews explaining the intent of the film, no behind-the-scenes documentation connecting the broadcast to the people who made it. Several cast members deliver memorable performances, yet their professional histories fade soon after. Some appear briefly in later work, others vanish entirely from public film records. None leave behind a clear narrative of a career shaped by this project. Don't Go to Sleep exists firmly in broadcast history. It aired, it was watched, but the human story behind it feels incomplete, as if the film was allowed to endure, while the identities behind it quietly slipped away. Fact 4. Night of Horror, 1981. Night of Horror is one of the most difficult titles in this episode to trace back to a clear human origin. It was released commercially and carried proper copyright markings. It appeared in video catalogs and circulated through standard distribution channels, but nearly every credit attached to it dissolves under closer examination. The director's name appears nowhere else in cinema history. The producers listed have no documented involvement in other films. Even the production company seems to exist only as a line of text without any verifiable business history. Information about the film's creation is inconsistent. Some sources contradict one another. Others omit critical details, entirely leaving large gaps where explanations should be. The cast once again disappears after this release. There are no clear filmographies, no interviews, and no records indicating continued work in entertainment. There are no confirmed production stills, no contemporary articles, no first-hand accounts explaining how the film was made or who funded it. Night of Horror feels less like a traditional project and more like a sudden appearance. A completed horror film that entered circulation and then shed every identifiable connection to its creators. Fact 5. The Children, 1980. Released at the start of a decade defined by regional horror and drive-in cinema, The Children reached audiences through legitimate distribution channels. It was advertised, screened, and later sold on home video. And yet, almost everything about its creation feels strangely incomplete. The director's credit leads to a name with no clear professional history. There is little evidence of a sustained filmmaking career, either before or after this project. The same applies to the credited writers and producers whose involvement appears limited to this single film. Production details are vague and often contradictory. Sources disagree on where the film was shot and how it was financed. There are no preserved behind-the-scenes photographs, no production anecdotes, and no reliable timeline of its development. The actors follow the same disappearing pattern. Several performers appear in major roles and then vanish from public records. No interviews exist that reflect on the experience. No later credits provide clarity about their careers. The Children feels historically unfinished, not because the film itself is incomplete, but because the story of its creation was never properly recorded. It exists as a finished horror movie released into the world. Fact 6. The Dorm That Dripped Blood, 1982. At first, The Dorm That Dripped Blood looks like a typical product of the early VHS-era, a low-budget slasher released into a market flooded with similar titles. It had a distributor. It had cover art. It circulated under more than one title in different regions. But its human history is almost impossible to reconstruct. The director's name appears with little supporting information. There is no clear career before the film and no confirmed work afterward. No interviews exist that explain how the project came together or what happened once it was finished. Writing and production credits are equally thin. Some releases list names that appear nowhere else in film records. Other versions reduce or rearrange the credits, suggesting revisions made without documentation. The production company presents a familiar pattern. It seems to exist solely for this one release. No additional films, No traceable personnel, no corporate footprint beyond a single credit line. The cast deepens the sense of erasure. Several actors appear prominently and then disappear from filmography databases altogether. There are no press photos, no retrospective discussions, and no evidence of continued acting careers. The dorm that dripped blood remains available to watch. Its images survive the decades, but the people who made it appear to have stepped away completely, leaving behind a horror film that no one ever truly claimed. Fact 7. The Being, 1983. The Being occupies an uneasy space between documentation and erasure. It was released publicly, carried proper copyright notices, and circulated through standard home video channels. On the surface, nothing about its release suggests anything unusual, but nearly every attempt to reconstruct its creation runs into uncertainty. The director's name appears inconsistently across sources, sometimes paired with conflicting information. The production company credited for the film has no clear history beyond this single title. Accounts of the film's development are vague and fragmented. There are no confirmed production timelines, no detailed financing records, and no preserved material that explains how the project moved from concept to completion. The cast offers little clarity. Several actors seem to have no verifiable filmography beyond this appearance. No interviews exist that reflect on their involvement or place the film within a broader career. The Being exists with just enough documentation to confirm that it is real, but not enough to explain who brought it into existence. It lingers as a finished horror movie, whose human origins remain unresolved, suspended between presence and absence. Fact 8. The Mutilator, 1984. At a glance, The Mutilator appears to be a straightforward slasher from the mid-1980s, released during a period when such films were aggressively produced and distributed. It carried alternate titles, passed through multiple distributors, and found its way onto video store shelves. Yet its origin story refuses to stay coherent. The director's identity is unusually isolated. Outside of this film, there is little verifiable evidence of sustained work in the industry. Details surrounding the production shift, depending on the source, with timelines and creative roles often conflicting. Credits themselves are unstable. Some releases highlight different producers. Others list names that cannot be reliably connected to any other projects. The cast follows the familiar disappearance seen throughout this episode. Several performers appear prominently and then leave no discernible trace in film or television. No interviews exist reflecting on their experience. No later credits clarify what became of them. What remains is a technically complete horror film, paired with an incomplete history. It entered circulation successfully, yet failed to leave behind a clear narrative of how it came together. The Mutilator feels less forgotten than disconnected, a film that survived while its past quietly dissolved. Fact 9. The Slayer, 1982. When The Slayer appeared during the early 1980s, it looked indistinguishable from dozens of other low-budget horror releases of the time. It had box art. It had distribution. It moved through the VHS market without drawing unusual attention. But its production history is strangely hollow. The director's name is tied almost exclusively to this single film. There is no documented path leading into the project, and almost nothing afterward. No interviews exist that clarify how the film was made or who shaped its creative direction. The same absence surrounds the credited writers and producers. Their names appear in isolation, detached from any wider body of work. No collaborations elsewhere. No traceable careers that help explain their involvement. Information about the shoot itself is scarce and often contradictory. There are no consistent accounts of filming locations or production timelines. No behind-the-scenes photographs that clearly identify a working crew. The cast reinforces the pattern. Several actors play central roles, then disappear from public film records completely. No follow-up appearances, no retrospective discussions, no evidence that the film marked the beginning or continuation of a career. The Slayer remains intact and watchable. But the people who created it seem to have stepped away the moment it was finished, leaving behind a horror film without a visible human footprint. Fact 10. The Prey, 1983. The Prey entered the early 1980s horror market, quietly appearing on home video shelves with little fanfare. It had a distributor packaging and a place within the commercial system, but nearly everything else about it is difficult to reconstruct. The director's credit leads to minimal information beyond this single title. Production company details vary across sources, sometimes contradicting one another, sometimes offering nothing more than a name without history. Credits themselves are inconsistent. Some versions omit roles that others include. In certain listings, key creative positions shift or disappear entirely, suggesting that the film passed through multiple stages without a stable record of authorship. The cast follows a familiar pattern. Several performers appear prominently, then disappear from filmography records altogether. There are no interviews, no personal reflections, and no clear indication that they continued working in entertainment. There is no reliable documentation of how the prey was financed. No confirmed accounts of where it was shot. No preserved behind-the-scenes material tying the finished product back to real people. The Prey exists as a completed horror film, not lost, not hidden, not unfinished. It was released, viewed, and then quietly allowed to drift away from the story of how it was made. Fact 11. Shadow Play, 1986. Shadow Play presents itself as a complete finished horror film, yet almost every attempt to link it to identifiable creators fails. The movie was released commercially and listed alongside other legitimate genre titles of its era. It had distribution catalog listings and proper copyright notices. And still its authorship remains almost entirely opaque. The director's name appears exclusively in connection with this one film. There is no record of earlier work and no evidence of a career afterward. The same is true for the credited writers and producers whose names surface once and then vanish without context. What distinguishes Shadow Play from similar cases is the total absence of supporting material. No production photographs, no anecdotes from the set, no archived interviews or recollections from anyone involved. Even the circumstances of its production remain unclear. There are no confirmed shooting locations, no documented financing details, and no surviving accounts that explain how the project was assembled. The film feels sealed not only as a narrative, but as a creation. It exists without a visible human network behind it, as if it emerged fully formed and was then intentionally separated from the people who made it. Fact 12. The Lamp, also known as The Outing, 1987. At first glance, The Lamp appears easier to trace than most films on this list. It had a theatrical title, an alternate release name, and a visible presence in the late 1980s home video market. But the more closely its history is examined, the less stable its identity becomes. Different releases present different versions of the film's authorship. Credits shift depending on whether the movie is listed as The Lamp or The Outing. Names are rearranged, emphasized, or quietly minimized, creating the impression that no single version of the film's origin was ever firmly established. The production company credited in some prints seems to exist only briefly. There is no extended business record, no additional projects, and no identifiable team that continued working together afterward. Once the film entered circulation, the company effectively disappeared. Information about the director and writer is similarly fragmented. Databases disagree, biographies are incomplete, and there is no clear creative through line before or after this project. It's as if the film passed through multiple hands without any of them leaving a lasting imprint. Several cast members appear in prominent roles, yet leave little to no trace beyond this film. There are no interviews reflecting on the production and no evidence that the release led to further opportunities. The Lamp survives clearly on tape and disc. Its images are intact. Its story is finished, but its identity feels edited as though the film was allowed to exist while its creators were gradually erased from view. Fact 13. The Dark Power, 1985. When the Dark Power entered the VHS market in the mid-1980s, it blended seamlessly into the flood of low-budget horror releases. It had packaging, it had distribution, it had an audience. What it never seemed to have was a visible human footprint. The director's name is attached to the film, yet leads almost nowhere. There is no documented rise into the project, and no clear continuation afterward. It feels less like a career moment and more like a brief appearance before vanishing. The production company credited for the film leaves behind almost no trace. No catalog of other titles, No identifiable creative partners, just a name frozen in time alongside this single release. Actors appear, deliver performances, and then fade completely from the historical record. Some have no confirmed roles beyond this film. Others leave behind nothing more than a credit line and silence. No interviews explain what the dark power was meant to be. No crew members later stepped forward to tell its story. The film exists without context, floating free from its creators. It was released. It was watched. And then everyone involved seemed to disappear, leaving the dark power behind, like an abandoned artifact. Fact 14. The Intruder, 1975. Released during the mid-1970s, The Intruder arrived at a time when low-budget horror films were flooding regional theaters and drive-ins. At first glance, it appears to be just another product of that era. Until its history is examined, the director's credit leads to a dead end. Databases list the name, but offer no background, no additional projects, and no explanation of how the film came to be. The writing credits are equally isolated, with no connection to any broader body of work. Documentation surrounding the production is inconsistent. Some sources list a production entity that cannot be verified elsewhere. Others omit that information entirely, leaving only a distributor that handled the release, but never the story behind it. The actors are just as elusive. The lead performer delivers a substantial role, yet has no traceable career beyond this film. There are no interviews, no archival photographs, no recorded reflections on the experience. There is no clear record of a premiere. No preserved reviews tied to identifiable critics. Only fragments, posters, listings, and the film itself. The Intruder feels less like a movie that emerged from a creative environment and more like something that slipped quietly into circulation without leaving behind the people who made it possible. A horror film that exists firmly on screen, but barely exists anywhere else. Fact 15. The Killing Hour, 1982. On the surface, The Killing Hour blends perfectly into the early 1980s horror landscape. It was released, commercially circulated on VHS, and carried the markings of a legitimate genre title from its era. But the illusion of normality collapses the moment you try to trace its creators. The director's name appears attached to this film and nowhere else. No earlier work, no later projects, no interviews reflecting on the production. The screenwriter follows the same pattern, existing only as a single line in the credits, with no creative trail beyond it. Even the production history feels unstable. Different releases credit different companies, some of which leave no corporate footprint outside this one film. In certain versions, those names vanish altogether, replaced only by a distributor that never publicly clarified the film's origins. The cast deepens the sense of disappearance. Several performers take on central roles, then never appear in another film. No press material, no retrospective commentary, no evidence that their involvement led anywhere else. What remains is a completed horror film with no reliable human context. It passed through the system, reached audiences, and then detached itself from everyone who could have claimed responsibility for it. The Killing Hour wasn't buried or erased. It was released and then left behind, as if its existence no longer needed witnesses. Bonus. Taken together, these films point to something unsettling. They weren't hidden. They weren't banned. They weren't lost to time. They were released normally, and then quietly abandoned by the people who made them. In the chaos of the VHS boom movies, could be treated like disposable objects. Once the tapes were shipped and sold, there was no reason for anyone to stay behind and be remembered. But what makes these films disturbing isn't poor documentation, it's the silence. No voices returned to claim authorship. No creators stepped forward when nostalgia brought these movies back into discussion. The film survived. The people did not. So ask yourself this: if these movies were allowed to exist without ownership, how many more are still out there, watchable, real, and unclaimed? If you know a horror film that feels like it came from nowhere, leave its name below. Somewhere beyond the edges of known cinema, more stories may still be waiting not to be found, but to be acknowledged.